Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Laura van der Ven, co-head and Europe marketing lead. Welcome to our webinar today on mastering EU CBAM, reporting requests and building strong EU relationships. Very excited that you're all here and to get started. But first, just a few announcements before we move to the main speakers. The webinar today will be recorded, and we'll make sure to send you the recording shortly after the webinar. Please, in the meantime, use the Q&A function in the chat to ask any questions that you have for our presenters and speakers. We'll have two Q&A sessions, one at the end of the plenary session, and then again at the end of the breakout sessions. So we will answer all relevant and also most common questions that you pose in that chat. Regarding the breakout sessions, you will be automatically moved into your preferred breakout session. Should there be any issues, please do let us know by using the chat. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we will be asking you to answer a bit of a feedback poll, as well as some questions during the webinar as well. So greatly appreciate your engagement with that. Welcome again, and please enjoy the webinar. Veronica, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone also from me to this webinar today. So my name is Veronica Thieme. I co-lead the Carbon Trust Europe team, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Davina, Cecile, and Rupert, who you will hear from later today in the breakout sessions for metals, fertilizers, and cement, respectively. And we're also very excited to be joined by Pavel Kizelyevsky from CCM, who you will also hear from in a little bit. Great. So we have a very full and exciting agenda for today's webinar. The webinar today is intended mainly for non-EU companies that may need to respond to CBAM requests from their EU customers. And as such, we've also structured the webinar agenda accordingly. The webinar today is split into two main parts. The first part will be a plenary session giving you an overview of EU CBAM, what it is, recent developments around it, as well as some general information around what the reporting requirements are. We will then hear from CCM about how they are responding to and approaching CBAM in practice, followed by a short Q&A where you will get the chance to ask some questions to Pavel and myself about CBAM. The second part of this webinar then consists of three different breakout sessions, one for the metal commodities covered by CBAM, one for fertilizers, and one for cement. Each of you will have selected which breakout session you would like to join. In these breakout sessions, we will then sort of continue our presentation to focus in more detail on the specific requirements for each commodity groups. And we will also help you better understand how CBAM data requests compare to existing data requests you may already be getting from your customers. We will then wrap up each breakout sessions with some key takeaways, next steps, and then again go into a Q&A session at the end to allow you to ask further questions as well. Great. So just a quick introduction to the Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust is a mission-driven organization. Our mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. As an organization, we've been working in the climate change space for over 20 years now, and we have over 400 experts working across the globe to provide expert advice to companies, governments, public sector bodies, and financial institutions on how to help them align themselves with a net zero future. And we do this by first helping organizations understand their key drivers of carbon emissions, impacts, and risks relating to both their organization and their value chain, which we then use to support the development of transition plans for their entire value chain, but also for their business models, as well as influencing wider system change. We also help companies execute their strategy and achieve goals and ambitions. This includes providing ongoing implementation support by tapping into sources of sustainable finance, such as green and sustainability-linked bonds and loans. To drive systemic change, we then also support in developing collaboration and innovation programs at both an industry and supply chain level, and we also support companies to communicate their impact through our verification and assurance support, which includes, for example, our growing product label. We also support organizations with understanding the latest policies and regulations and how they could impact their business and sustainability agendas, as well as helping them find ways to turn a compliance exercise into something that can help them advance their net zero agenda. And this is also the purpose of today's webinar on the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, EU CBAM, which will have both reporting but also financial implications for both European as well as non-European companies. And this is a regulation that I would say we've gotten a lot of questions about, again, both from EU but also non-EU companies who are impacted, especially given the uncertainty around this regulation that we've seen really over quite a few years now. And this pushback, of course, includes the sort of discussion around how CBAM has been getting on and how it will impact trade and competitiveness. And then more recently, of course, the announcement of the proposed changes to the EU CBAM that were communicated as part of the EU Omnibus proposal. This EU Omnibus proposal, which was released end of February, was put together by the European Commission with the aim to simplify corporate sustainability reporting, including also EU CBAM. Now, while I'm sure that many of your news feeds and LinkedIn feeds have been filled with commentary on the EU Omnibus proposal, we think it's important to also acknowledge that this is just a proposal at this stage, and it will take some time until it is agreed by the EU Parliament, and even longer before it is then transposed into national laws. Until then, the proposal can still change, so it is important that businesses until then maintain their focus on transitioning towards net zero, and not lose momentum as it relates to planning and reporting as well. As it stands, the current proposal does also impact CBAM, as it proposes to change the scope of CBAM by implementing a new minimum threshold introduced per importer of 50 metric tons of the relevant materials annually. This change will remove CBAM obligations for around 90% of importers, while still covering approximately 99% emissions that were initially targeted by EU CBAM. So it mainly excludes very small importers and individual consumers, and this means that it's also likely that it will still cover many of our listeners today who are exporting their products into Europe. But this really depends on what your customer base looks like. For example, if you're exporting over 50 metric tons to one customer, then I think it can be quite certain that, of course, they will also need to comply to EU CBAM and still require data from you. If, however, you're exporting less than 50 tons to one customer, it really depends how much they're importing from other suppliers, and if their cumulative imports from all their suppliers is over the 50 ton threshold. If it is, then they would also still, again, require data from you. So this is the main change that's proposed in the Omnibus proposal that's affecting CBAM, but there are others. There's a plan to introduce other transition measures to give businesses more time to adapt, as well as simplifying many CBAM processes, such as data collection, emissions tracking and calculations, as well as reporting requirements, and introducing more streamlined processes. As mentioned, these are proposed amendments, and changes may still be made. So again, it is also important to stay up to date on any further developments around this. Now, before we get into our overview of EU CBAM, we just wanted to do a quick sort of temperature check and a quick poll to better understand what your main challenges are around implementing and responding to CBAM. So in a few seconds, you should hopefully see a poll pop up with 3 different challenges that we've seen around CBAM. These include obtaining company-wide support and resources to meet the requirements under CBAM, understanding what those requirements actually are, collecting the requested information or data, and finally, finding it challenging to work with your customers to understand their CBAM requests. So hopefully you will have seen the poll pop up, and then we should be able to also see the results of the poll in a second. Okay, perhaps we'll see the results at a later stage. I guess hopefully many of the sort of challenges that we have listed, we can at least start helping you with during the webinar today, as we help you understand what the CBAM requirements are and how to use the CBAM requirements, and then ideally also turn them into an opportunity to decarbonize your product emissions and operations and reduce costs. But first, some of the basics around what CBAM is and how it has come about. So CBAM, as many other regulations in the European Union, is linked to the European Green Deal, which is essentially a set of policy initiatives or a roadmap that aims to set out how to reach known net greenhouse gas emissions. It covers all sectors of the economy via different initiatives. And as a result of these, as well as existing ones, like, for example, the EU emissions trading scheme, there was an increased concern about carbon leakage, which can happen when companies move their operations away from locations with more stringent climate policies due to higher costs that are linked to these policies. As a result, the effectiveness of these climate policies can be reduced, which of course will impact the global reduction of emissions. And the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism aims to avoid or reduce carbon leakage by effectively putting a carbon price on imports into the EU of certain products that are already captured also under the EU ETS, and thereby aiming to prevent the undermining of these climate actions. So this is the objective behind the EU CBAM regulation. It currently applies to 6 different product groups that are highly carbon intensive: electricity, hydrogen, iron and steel, aluminium, cement, and fertilizers. But the intention is to expand the scope to more products in the future. In practice, what EU CBAM means is that any EU-based companies that are importing these products into the EU need to report the amount of these products that they import and the associated emissions, as well as eventually purchase sufficient CBAM certificates to cover the emissions from these imports. A key thing to note is that the reporting obligations under CBAM only apply to the European Union, so not to goods that are being imported into the European Economic Area and Switzerland, for example. Officially, the EU CBAM has been in place since October of 2023. Considering sort of the administrative aspects that are associated with CBAM, it was sort of anticipated that it would require an adjustment period, and EU CBAM is therefore implemented using a phased approach. The first phase is the transition period. So this is the phase we are in now, and it has been effective, as I said, since 2023, and it will last until the 1st of January of 2026. During this period, EU-based companies are required to report quarterly on any CBAM products they have imported, as well as the associated emissions. And throughout this period, there have also been several adjustments that have been made to tighten the rules around calculating emissions, again, with the intention to slowly allow companies to improve their calculations and reporting over time. From January 2026 onwards is when the definitive period of EU CBAM starts, and this is where the financial implications will kick in. And then in around 5 years' time, so around the 2030 mark and onwards, is when the Commission then plans to look at also extending the scope of EU CBAM to more products that are also covered by the EU ETS, for example. One thing to note is that under current regulation, once the definitive period starts, importers will purchase certificates to cover their emissions from the 1st of January onwards on a quarterly basis, but report and surrender those certificates annually. With the proposed EU omnibus changes, no certificates would need to be bought until 2027 to then cover the 2026 reporting period. Great. So to go into a bit more detail on how the transitional and definitive periods differ. So firstly, the transitional period, as mentioned, is a sort of pilot phase to help all stakeholders involved learn and adjust to the requirements. During this period, EU importers of CBAM products only need to report on the amount of CBAM products they have imported and the associated emissions on a quarterly basis. There are no financial obligations, and companies do not yet need to purchase and surrender any certificates. In terms of calculating emissions, before the 31st of December 2024, companies still had the choice between 3 different methods of calculating the emissions from the CBAM products they are importing, allowing also for methods that allow for more estimations. Since January of this year, however, there has been an update to this, and now only the EU method is accepted, which only allows for estimations in specific cases, as we will elaborate more on during the breakout rooms. Then in January 2026, as mentioned, the definitive period will start. So from then on, reporting will no longer be quarterly, but annually. So the first reports will then need to be submitted by 2027. The reporting boundaries will also be slightly different for certain products, as my colleagues will again elaborate on more during the breakouts. And there will also be verification and financial obligations that the EU-based importers will need to meet, which of course again includes the buying and surrendering of certificates to cover all of the reported emissions. And the price of the EU CBAM certificates will be aligned to the carbon price under the EU ETS, and it will be expressed in terms of euros per tons of CO2. Good. So what are the requirements for EU importers under the definitive phase? So all importers covered by CBAM will first need to check and confirm which of their imports are covered under CBAM. For now, by checking the CN codes, and then for each product that is included, report both the quantity and the embedded emissions on the CBAM registry. This is also what is currently required under the transitional phase. And what is then different for the definitive period is that once the total number of covered emissions has been determined, the importer will then need to purchase certificates to cover the corresponding emissions, as well as report any carbon price due or paid in the country of origin for the embedded emissions, as this will be subtracted from the total price that will need to be paid. Very important to know for all non-EU companies that will be required to provide the emissions data to their EU customers is that there is a new portal developed on the EU CBAM registry that has been developed for non-EU companies to enable non-EU companies to share their company information, as well as relevant and CBAM aligned emissions data. So through this portal, your customers, your customers will be able to essentially access this data using your unique EORI number, which means that you would only need to submit the data once for all your customers to see, and hopefully reducing some of the administrative burden for non-EU companies. For any sort of further information on this, there is detailed guidance on how to register, access, and also use this sort of part of the registry for this purpose on the European Commission's website. Great, so that concludes our sort of very brief overview of EU CBAM. Now, before we split into the individual commodity-specific breakout groups, I am very excited to introduce our next speaker of today, Pavel Kizelyevsky. Pavel is CEO and co-founder of CCM Technologies, which is an award-winning clean tech company based in the UK that manufacture ultra-low carbon fertilizers, and with whom the Carbon Trust has been working with for many years. And Pavel will be sharing with us a little bit on CCM's experiences, challenges, and also learnings with respect to CBAM. Great, so Pavel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Veronica. So look, we come at this from a slightly different perspective, which hopefully is valuable, partly because we have a foot in both camps. Obviously, we left the European Union, foolishly in my view, but I'm half Irish and half Polish, so I sit with, as I said, with a foot in both camps. The other thing is, to put us into perspective, what CCM does is we are a carbon capture, utilization and sequestration technology. So we use CO2 and we also sequester CO2. The first outcome of that was the creation of the ultra low carbon fertilizers with customers like Pepsi and Nestle and other global FMCGs, with water companies and with the big retailers. But we're also involved in a project in Europe where we are taking the CO2 generated by a cement manufacturer and turning that into precipitated calcium carbonate, very specifically PCC, because that is one of the criteria under which the ETS credits are due. So in that instance, we're eliminating the CO2 emissions from the cement manufacturer and then transforming that into precipitated calcium carbonate, which will attract revenue. And the interesting piece for us is that the byproduct of all of that is a liquid, low carbon ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which we already have customers for from our big global FMCGs. So that's where we sit in terms of the scheme. The UK started getting involved in discussing CBAMs back in 2019, and we were involved in that first discussion group in Parliament as to exactly how that was going to manifest itself in the United Kingdom. My belief very strongly, and I was with government yesterday, is that we will mirror pretty much what Europe does, but will be 1 year later. So the introduction is in 2027 and certificates in 2028 is the current expectation. So again, the first observation, I think, for us, and maybe a challenge for everybody from every industry, whether that's metals or cement or fertilizers, is the fact that there is going to be change between now and the transition date at the end of this year. And I don't wish to blow smoke over the Carbon Trust, but I will do for two reasons. One is because the information they've provided, particularly in the most recent report, gives you a very clear view on what the situation is today. But what I could guarantee is that that will change numerous times between now and the end of the year. And so I'm very, from our business point of view, is to stay incredibly nimble to try and adjust to what the changes are. Where clearly there's a lot of influence coming from the United States. I've heard people even yesterday in Parliament talk about CBAMs as a tariff, and tariff clearly is a very emotive word at the moment. I don't think it is. I think it's a carbon levy, but people are definitely going to start the debate as to where it fits in terms of our relationships with the United States, whether that's the UK and or EU. So I think the need to remain extremely nimble with our business plans is a critical piece of it. From our perspective in fertilizer, there are also a number of other characteristics that I think is worth mentioning. A report came out of Cambridge University a couple of years ago and was published in Nature magazine, showed that the emissions from synthetic fertilizers and manures is 2.6 gigatons. Well, that doesn't mean much to me, but what it does do is when they put the context by saying that is more than the emissions globally from aviation and shipping, which is why it becomes such a key issue. PepsiCo, which is one of our big customers, has also put the context on it, which I think is helpful in this instance by saying that within crops like barley and oats, their external analysis is telling them that the emissions for those crops end to end, 80% plus is because of the fertilizer that's being used. So this is not just about fertilizer, this is about the whole food chain end to end and the impact that that has. Maybe if I took one moment to diverge, one of the things that I think for us is where food and potentially other industries involved in this call, where it meets geopolitics. One of the surprising statistics that came out last year is that in the 12 months from July 22 to June 23, the European Union doubled its imports of Russian urea, a fertilizer. So 3 months after the start of the invasion, the EU doubled its imports. It's an extraordinary statistic, and the CEO of Yara, the world's largest fertilizer company based out of Norway, did say that the European has a real challenge to not find itself in exactly the same position it was with regards to Russian gas pre the crisis. And I think, again, we need to understand where our industries sit up against geopolitics. The second point I'd make is data. A lot has been made about the need to report the data. But to be honest, from our perspective, what we're seeing is that the requirement to deliver our customers like Pepsi and Nestle credible data to allow them to really understand their position, particularly as it relates to their supply chain, so scope 3, and how they can reduce that becomes absolutely vital. So right now, well, for the last 3 years, CCM has been working on ensuring that we have very credible, verifiable data, and that was part of the exercise we entered into with the Carbon Trust. And again, I don't wish to blow smoke over the Carbon Trust, but what we have discovered, having had that methodology imposed upon us by the Carbon Trust and the results of what our carbon footprint is on the manufacturing emissions, is that it then gives us very valuable accreditation to our customers like Pepsi and Nestle. I mean, vital. So that is the key part of it. You will find the Carbon Trust is not a soft touch when you go through these methodologies, but nor should they be. Because if we're going to produce very viable and honest data, we need to ensure that the mechanisms for assessing that are extremely robust. So data for us is absolutely vital, not just for the reporting piece. The other one is local partnerships, because we manufacture currently in the United Kingdom for fertilizer, but we already have this plant going online next week in Europe around this cement project that I mentioned. And for us, the third element is local partnerships. And you need to pick your partners correctly, because again, that's going to be the insurance in terms of being able to navigate what is going to be an ever-changing picture with regards to the whole data piece. As I say, the omnibus package for us is just a signal that so much is going to change between now and the end of the year. For us, it's probably the biggest single business opportunity, because we think our data is so robust that it will allow us to compete with our peers in the industry, because we don't believe at this stage that their data is as robust as ours. The finance piece, again, the conversations we have with major funders, our primary relationship is with the Bank of America, and B of A is absolutely adamant that the need to provide the data for them to provide solid green finance options for us is also a key part of it. So if I left you with those three messages, it's around the data piece, it's around remaining flexible and having very strong local partnerships to ensure that you succeed with what I think is the biggest business opportunity that we've seen for a long time. I'm just short of my 10 minutes, but I think that's probably the right moment to stop.
Thank you, Powell. That was really insightful, and I think ties in quite nicely with some of the questions that we're receiving as well. Maybe to start off with, around the poll answers, what was the biggest barrier you faced when implementing CBAM requests? Obtaining company-wide support and resources came out as the largest barrier. So I was wondering, Powell, maybe you can share a little bit about your experience on obtaining kind of company-wide support. And if you've got any advice for our
Interestingly,
audience.
to that question, I actually put that at the bottom. That was my least important one, so that's interesting. So I'm completely out of line with the other people on this call. We within an organization have made it very clear to everybody that the critical nature of CBAM is. When CBAM first emerged on the horizon in 2019, people just went, really, is this important? And I think the realization, because we spent the last 5 years hopefully sharing with colleagues why it is going to be critical, particularly as we expand out of the UK into Europe, that we need to do this. So we've not really found that, and we've resourced accordingly.
Wonderful, thank you. I also wanted to touch upon what you mentioned around staying nimble, particularly around all the uncertainty at the moment around CBAM, geopolitical issues, etc. Do you have any recommendations to attendees or companies on how to build that into business planning?
I think for us, we've been lucky in terms of having very high-level C-suite relationships with our customers, like Pepsi's chairman, the CEO of Nestle, the main board director in charge of supply chain at the big brewer in Holland, that I can't mention, but I'm sure you know who that is. Look, those have really been insightful for us, particularly as we are seeing a general trend of watering down on corporate commitments to Scope 3 and emissions generally, in light of what's happened in terms of the change of the administration in the United States. I think there are two things I'd say. One is that I think a lot of the commitments to reduce have been over-ambitious. And I think what we're seeing is a resetting of the bar to much more realistic levels. So I don't actually see companies are going to radically change in terms of slowing down their commitments to reducing it. A number of the companies we talk to are saying, look, we don't manage our business on 4-year election cycles. We manage our business for the long term. And I think that's very clear to me, that while they may be dialing down some of the social media things about how wonderful we're going to be in 2025 in terms of emissions. And I think the third point I'd make is staying very clear about what your customers are doing with regards to offsetting. Nestle very publicly about a year ago put out a statement saying they would no longer be offsetting, i.e. buying credits in the Amazon for some trees, because they believe that that was greenwashing, and only insetting, i.e. making changes within their organization, would be seen to be valuable. And we fully support that view. But again, you have to be very clear and on top of your relationships with your key customers to know that, so you can then anticipate how you're going to adjust. In that case, that's probably the biggest single business opportunity, because when Nestle says they're only going to be doing insetting and we have an insetting solution, that's good, but we needed to be very fast in responding to that and making sure that we were on top of that as we had dialogue with that company.
Thanks, Powell. That was really insightful. And I think, I'm just going to keep going on the last topic or important key message that you had around data. And also wondering there, do you have any recommendations or best practices for data management within the company and supply chain that you're working on?
So on the data piece, we worked at building our own proprietary platform to collect the data. We decided to hold that on AWS, Amazon Web Services. But actually, the newest initiative we've done is to work with Google Cloud, because they are very keen to assist in the presentation of data and how it's the messaging comes from that. So again, I think this is our first port of call was to build our own. You know, that's always tricky because your developer leaves for 6 months and to live on the beach in Bali, and you're a bit stuffed, or you buy a shrink wrap product and it's not exactly right for your business. So we went for the option A. The second thing is ensuring it is secured, and that was the reason we went to AWS. But thirdly is the interpretation piece, and that's what we hadn't maybe done as much work as I would have liked, and that's why the work we're doing with Google Cloud is going to accelerate, because we think we need to be able to be in a position to present the data. Similarly, the data that Carbon Trust has given us at the end of 2023 on the manufacturing emissions of our process. I don't think in the last year that you've given us that data, we've presented it in the way that we can best maximize the impact with our customers.
Great, thank you. I think what I will, the second biggest barrier that came out of the poll was really around understanding CBAM requirements. And a question came in a little bit around this, maybe Veronica, one for you. Has there been any indication on the scope expansion for additional CBAM goods in terms of what it would include and any reporting rules?
In terms of extension of CBAM to additional commodities, so as mentioned, that will sort of start around the 2030s. There hasn't been really an indication yet or a concrete timeline. I think the only thing that I also mentioned before was that it's likely going to include other commodities that are also covered by EU ETS. But yeah, as of now, there's not much more of a concrete sort of timeline or indication of what that will look like.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the first Q&A session. Thank you, Powell. Thank you, Veronica. We are now going to move to the breakout sessions. You will all be automatically moved into the breakout session you indicated as preference in the registration in the next minute or so. Yeah, if you have any issues, do use the chat, and I'd like to encourage everyone to keep posting questions in the chat to facilitate a really interesting discussion. Thanks again, Powell. I think really helpful recommendations for our audience today.
Pleasure.